Hey everyone, this is lecture 14.1. In this one, we're going to try to tie things together a little bit and kind of show where a social movement would take this material. So, we're going to address what is change. We're going to talk about the role unions have to play in that, namely because when it comes to socioeconomics and social class, the social movement that most actively engages in that are unions. We'll talk about community organizing. We'll talk about some other social movements. We're going to talk about how those groups raise awareness. We're going to talk about how quickly social change occurs. And then actually ignore that final exam study sessions bit. That's a bit of a artifact. So, social change is a transition that occurs in society between one way of doing things and another. That's to say one not on. Social change may be broad, so it could be a bunch of things kind of interconnected all at once, kind of like what we think is or is not polite, how we treat children, etc. Or it could be really specific. It could be granting greater rights to an entire group of people, broad. It could be how we cover our nose, very specific. In 2012, I believe, maybe 2011, there was a major scare that there was going to be a pandemic. That was the second swine flu pandemic. The first one happened in the late 1970s. Anyway, before that pandemic scare, everyone sneezed in their hands. And some of your parents may still do that, and especially your grandparents, right? That's how we were taught before that moment. We knew we were sneezing germs into our hands, but that's just how you do it, and then you wash your hands afterward. But then, over the course of that about a 6-month period, everyone shifted to sneezing into their elbows, or at least most people did, to the point where now, especially post-COVID, the idea of sneezing into your hands is like really super gross to think about. Social change is typically either progressive or regressive. Progressive change wants to change things in a way that hasn't existed before, and this is typically what we think of in terms of being liberal or left-wing. Regressive change then wants to keep things the way that they have always been or the way that they used to be. For example, the Make America Great Again movement is prototypical regressive social movement kind of stuff. They strive to make America great again from their perception of what America was before, regardless of whether that's based in reality or not, right? That wants to keep things the same or go back, right? Regress. One tip here, if you're trying to understand this material, please don't cross-research your stuff with the propaganda of the Chinese Revolution. That was some very specific usage of the term regression that doesn't really apply to what we're talking about here. Moving on, though. Both of these are based on perception, right? So both progressive and regressive movements don't have to be based in reality. So a progressive movement may want to change society in ways that just aren't possible and could be fantastical. Similarly, the way things used to be with a regressive movement might not be how they were, or might not be possible to go back to that way that they used to be. So in the material we're going over this week, we look at social change in terms of 3 fronts to help fix poverty in the United States. We can talk about how we want to deal with poverty on the job, and that's what unions would do. We can look at dealing with poverty in the community. So we could look at community organizing on the meso level, that middle level of sociology. And we can look at social change and social movements on the national level. And there have been social movements to attempt to help poverty on the international level, but that is kind of some layers of complexity that we really, at this point in the course, don't care so much to go into. It would take a lot to fully explain all that stuff. So let's define a social movement. A social movement is a coalition of individuals and organizations that work together to cause or prevent social change. So usually when we think about social movements, we think about groups that are trying to change things, but there are those regressive movements that do move to try to keep things the way they used to be. Social movements are almost always made up of multiple social movement organizations. Sometimes these are called SMOs. So for example, Martin Luther King was a leader in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, sometimes called the SCLC. That was one organization, that was one SMO. And that SMO interacted with other SMOs to create the civil rights movement. It's commonly misunderstood that Martin Luther King was like the leader of the civil rights movement. No, he was a leader. He was a very prominent leader, but there were many leaders. He's just the one that kind of history textbooks like to latch on to. And I mean, he was a great man, but he's one of many. SMOs have the following features. They have organization. There is some way that members interact with each other in a regular basis, and to go with that organization, you can also say they have structure. What are the roles of people in the group? That's the structure of the group. Organizations have leadership. So an SMO must have somebody who is in charge, or a group of people who are in charge, to decide how it's going to work. And then SMOs must have an ideological commitment to cause or prevent change. That's where they get to be regressive or progressive. So for example, Black Lives Matter is a social movement, but it is not a social movement organization because BLM does not have centralized leadership, right? So in this way, BLM is like a modern day version of the civil rights movement, but it is not a modern day version of King's Southern Poverty Leadership Conference. I got that wrong, but Martin Luther King's group. Now, every social movement of any size does develop a counter movement, or at least any social movement that's actually causing some change develops a counter movement. And this is a major indicator that your social movement is being effective. You're doing stuff, you're getting attention, and thus the people that like things the way they used to be want to try to stop that, right? Counter movements are sometimes purely reactionary. So they might just be that they don't like the social movement that's come into being, or they can be, people who have advocated for something for a prolonged period of time, right? So an example here, this is dated because the Tea Party, as it existed in the early 2010s, was very much kind of the precursor to the modern Make America Great Again movement. The Tea Party was espousing very politically conservative, economically conservative kind of ideas, and laid that groundwork for the modern Republican Party, the way it's changed in the last 15 years. And then the Coffee Party, less clear on what its ideas exactly were. They basically were the Democrat version of the thing, pretty poorly planned out. Their whole premise just basically was, hey, that Tea Party's stupid. Aren't they stupid? We're going to talk about coffee and be Democrats. That's a really example of a very obviously reactionary movement that doesn't have much really backing it behind it. And then obviously reactionary movements can be any political shape or variation. There are conservative reactionary movements. There are progressive reactionary movements. Now, social movements that help the poor do face certain specific challenges that other social movements may not necessarily face. Uh, regard Almost every social movement has like kind of its own little weirdsies, but because of the nature of capitalism and because of the nature of social class as it exists in the United States, there are certain things that poor people's movements have to deal with. One of them being poor people. Being poor is stigmatized, right? People are not proud to be poor the way they are proud to be rich or middle class or even working class. Those are groups that over our history have had like that identity pride movements that has never existed for poor people's pride, for example. Additionally, poor people do not have the same time or resources as other groups, right? Because this is an identity directly tied to your economic well-being and how well effectively you are surviving in our economic system. And resource mobilization theory states that the organization that best uses its resources and uses its resources effectively wins. Well, because poor people's organizations have less access to the resource of money, then they would be expected to be less able to be effective, at least in terms of using money, right? Now, with that said, resource deprivation theory also states that people are more likely to persist. I'm sorry, I skipped over there. Let me clarify that slightly. A resource mobilization theory states if you don't have much money, you're not going to be successful. But there's another theory called relative deprivation theory that states, different theory, that people are more likely to participate in social movements if they feel that they are oppressed or deprived. So from these two standpoints, resource mobilization theory would expect poor people's movements to be less effective because they have less access to the money and the resources that they would want and need. But relative deprivation theory states that poor people would actually be more likely to participate in a social movement because they can actively feel their suffering and want to change things in the way that a comfortable middle class person may not necessarily want to. Now let's shift into talking about labor unions. So each union in the United States is part of a larger social movement called the American Labor Movement. So those individual unions, those would be your social movement organizations, and then the whole thing is the American Labor Movement. This is actually a very old social movement that has gone through multiple eras of existence. There have been multiple waves of union organization, and as with other social movements, when does a wave start and when does it end? That is a matter kind of debate and often can't be determined until about 50 years after it started, right? That kind of thing. History makes things very clear. But we do see these in the labor movement. The first union in the United States, which can be said to be the start of the first wave of unionization, was the did they call themselves? The Boot and Shoe Workers Union, and they were established in 1794, I believe, in Boston, in the United States. And oh no, actually that's the name right there, the Federal Society of Journeymen and Cordwainers, which meant shoemakers. It's such an old union that our word for shoemaker changed. So, obviously though, or maybe not obviously, this idea of workers banding together is very old, and it's older than the United States. The general strategy of organizing is based on the idea of medieval trade guilds. Trade guilds being groups of people who make the same thing or do the same kind of work, right? And so you become a member of that guild to learn how to do the things, and then when people need that kind of work done, they go to the guild, and the guild then finds you a worker that you would need to do your job. that's actually really similar to how modern construction unions and electrical unions, plumbing unions, those trade unions, that's really close to how they still are structured in a lot of ways. And then modern philosophies and strategies of unions really kind of updated the guild structure and shifted it into a union structure for the modern era, because we went from kind of an artisan economy where if you are someone who binds books or makes shoes or makes chairs, you have that knowledge set other people don't have. Well, that changed moving into the era of industrialization, where the average worker no longer had an entire skill set of how to make something. They only had the ability to do work, right? They, as Marx would say, they only had control over their own capacity to work. So the guild shifted over to being unions, who were groups of people who could work. Unions were not legally recognized in the United States until 1935. And this is very significant because unions started organizing in the United States, as I mentioned, in the late 1700s. They really did a lot of work in the mid-1800s, especially after the Civil War. And that period from the mid-1800s to almost the mid-1900s, they were doing that without legal recognition, right? So they were doing something that wasn't illegal, but challenged the status quo in a way that made them countercultural, is a good way to put it. Unions were at their height of their power in the 1950s in the United States, at least up to this point. At that point, 35% of workers were represented by unions. That is huge. Most of those unions then of that era would have been in traditionally called blue-collar work, your electricians, plumbers, construction, steel mill workers, lumber mill workers, factory workers, etc. Today, it is just under 10% of workers are represented by unions. Actually, that's slightly out of date. Over the last 10 to 15 years, we have started to see an uptick in union organization. Remember how I said that when waves start, it's hard to tell when a new wave has started and when it's just kind of hiccuped? There is speculation that we are at the beginning of a new union organization era, that being indicated by the fact that Starbucks workers are increasingly organizing. The Starbucks workers unions kind of are becoming emblematic of food service, what is possible among food service workers. That's really a very big deal. And additionally then, with the organization of the massive Amazon factories on the East Coast, that is very, very promising also for unions, that it's possible to make that massive employer that is Amazon force them to work with unions as well. That's very promising for the union movement right now. But the question comes up, what exactly is a union? That is, of course, as with all questions that are worth asking, very complicated. A general definition is that a union is a group of workers who pool resources toward the end of getting pay and better working conditions. So these are workers who stick together to try to make their workplace better. However, based on the law in given countries, different unions look different in different countries. In some countries, unions effectively control the government. In some countries, unions are based not on workplace as they are in the United States, but in region. So in the United States, if I am a teacher at Ohio State and Ohio State has a teachers union, then I am in a separate unit or a separate organization than, say, the teachers at Otterbein or at Columbus State, etc. In Spain and in France, their unions are organized based on geography. So any union, for example, in that system, say in Franklin County in central Ohio, all of the workers of a given type would be in one entity that is that union. And that might sound like a trivial difference, but that's a real big difference, because when workers are organized geographically, they become capable of shutting down like cities in what's called a general strike. So those countries are much more interested in keeping their working people happy, namely because if they don't, well, everything's going to shut down. So, as I alluded to, the American definition of and the way we organize in the United States is that a union is a group of workers who come together toward the end of creating a legally binding contract with an employer via collective bargaining. What the hell does that mean? What it means is that in the U.S., we in unions work with employers in a legal apparatus to make a contract that oversees basically how the workplace operates. Defining collective bargaining, that is contract negotiation that takes place between an employer and the workers in a bargaining unit. And then a bargaining unit is a group of workers within a workplace who are legally recognized by a union, right? All of this is to say that what unions do in the United States across the board is they negotiate contracts for workers. That's the short of it, right? And that's what they do in the United States. Different countries do unions slightly different. Different countries organize and are focused their unions slightly differently. In the United States, the way they do it is through contracts. So, it should be pointed out that American citizens have the economic right to attempt to form a union. That is absolutely as much of a right as you have as the freedom of speech, as the freedom to bear arms. You have a right to meet with at least one other person to try to get a union. That is absolutely fully legal in any situation, regardless of what your boss tells you otherwise. That kind of activity is called concerted activity, which is activity that is engaged in toward the end of forming a union. It is illegal to fire a worker because they engaged in concerted activity. And this is protected under the National Labor Relations Act. This is the cornerstone of union organizing in the United States. If you ever would be in such a situation, usually these representation cards are given out. What that means is that when you sign this card, and it looks scary, and bosses take advantage of the fact that it looks scary. Basically, signing that card is legally documenting that you are a person in the United States, right? So you are saying, me as a person in the United States who can be found, I like the idea that we should have a union election. That's what it is. That's what it's saying, despite the fact that it looks like a scary card, right? And it's nothing else. It's nothing else. If that scares you, you can actually ask the union to have your card back and have it removed, and they have to do that, right? They can't just steal your identity with that information. And then once more than half of those workers sign those cards, then the union can file for election to so that the workers can vote on whether they want to have a union or not. Now, it should be pointed out that as of the date of this recording, this set of laws has shifted in this year, being 2023. If you are interested in union organizing, I suggest reaching out to a union. Don't try to do it yourself because it's very complicated, and union organizers are very good at what they do. And you have to have at least one other person. And once you start doing this, it is a good idea to keep a journal of what happens in your workplace, just kind of like a little note. Because if you keep that kind of journal and your boss does try to fire you for union activity, that kind of journal is what you need to basically file a lawsuit that you were fired for unjust means. That's kind of like the ammunition that you need to be able to prove that thing. Yeah. So, unions do help all workers, whether you are in a union or aren't in the union. I have been in working situations where I have been a member of the union. I have been in working situations where even if I wanted to be in the union, I wouldn't be allowed to be in the union because of the rules of the specific workplace. And I've been in both situations in which unions have absolutely helped me. I have never been in a situation when the union has not helped me. There are some people who have had weird situations, but overall, my personal stance is even a bad union, even a union that isn't good at what it is, still is good for you. Unions help workers directly by giving us a voice in the workplace. They are a way to talk to the boss in a way that the boss has to listen to you. Additionally, through union contracts, wages are increased, benefits are increased, and working conditions are improved. If you don't get those things through your union, then you have a really bad union. The point of the union is to increase your wages, is to increase your benefits, and is to increase your working conditions. Now, if you have had a union contract for like 25 years, every single contract may not necessarily get better and better. But if you have only had a union contract for maybe 3 years, and 4 years ago, the workplace didn't have a union, look at how the workers were treated before the union versus how workers were treated after the union, and in almost every single circumstance, you're going to see a big difference in how workers are treated and a big improvement. If you're not in the union, the unions help by increasing wages for all workers, and that's true. Because if I am a boss and I have to increase wages for the union workers, that is going to force me to have to increase wages for the non-union workers at least a little bit to keep them all from quitting, right? Is basically what happens, right? Because it is a bad look to increased wages for all the union people, but you just give the not union people nothing. I mean, again, some bosses make those decisions, but the overall tendency is that everyone gets improvements in the workplace when the union gets the improvements. Similarly, unions, by getting workers to make more money, stimulate local economies and local businesses. So even people who are economically conservative like to talk about stimulating economies and encouraging people to spend money. Well, a great way to encourage workers to spend money is to raise their wages so they feel comfortable spending money. Unions advocate for more generous welfare states and other worker causes. So often when unions get political, not every union gets political, but some do. When they get political, they advocate for economic rights. They advocate for raising things like minimum wages, for better benefits for retirees, etc. And then it's shown on a global level that nations with stronger unions have lower poverty rates, period. You wouldn't be able to see that just by looking at the United States with the union percentage and its percentage of poverty, because if you've taken a methods course in sociology, you know that's an N of 1, and an N of 1 doesn't really show you anything. But if you look across the world with countries that have active unions, then you can definitely see that relationship. Now let's move and shift into this related thing of community organizing. Community organizing is the practice of educating and helping communities collectively solve problems that they face. Community organizing can be a powerful way to dismantle the types of social isolation that were studied by William Julius Wilson when we talked about his isolating effects, right? We put a lot of effort into that. Additionally, unions can't, I'm sorry, not unions, well, they could be, but community organizing often focuses on quality schools, decent housing, adequate infrastructure, economic activities, available jobs, basically all of William Julius Wilson's things, right? And they do that by getting people in a neighborhood, a community, a city to come together to make the community better and to try to find the elements in the community that are making things worse, right? And this kind of model really matches up with American values of community, right? Of we should all work together to make the place we live better. That's something that we tend to like regardless of our political ideology in our country, and you know that's not very common for a lot of things. It is generally accepted that one of the major strengths of the Obama presidential run in 2008 was that he had personal experience in community organizing. And the 2008 election cycle was kind of when the United States first became aware of, hey, what's community organizing, right? And then, of course, as with all things political, it became highly politicized, where Republicans were talking about how horrible community organizers were, and Democrats were talking about how amazing community organizers were, and a lot of both of them didn't really know what they were talking about, right? Well, the gist of it is that President Obama was working off of principles of community organizing to drive his presidential campaign, and the biggest element of that was getting people who are volunteering for you to try so hard because they really believe in what they're doing. That was the major advantage of that campaign, was to get his volunteers to feel like, yeah, I'm changing the world. Yeah, I'm making a big difference. That was the strength there. I talked about resource mobilization theory earlier. Often resource mobilization theory is used to explain economic advantages, and it's usually very good at that. In the 2008 election, both McCain and Obama had just about similar economic resources. They really did. But you can see that there was a massive different resource that Obama had, which was his ability to get his volunteers to try super duper hard, right? We see a similar resource mobilization phenomena in the 2016 Trump victory for president, wherein Trump had this kind of media persona celebrity, especially the way Twitter was working for him in 2016. That was his resource that he capitalized on that Clinton was not able to really make happen for her. Grassroots organizing, then, this community organizing thing, this is at the root of community organizing, is how it works. The definition of grassroots organizing being efforts that focus on building relationships between individuals in a community and having those individuals play major roles in overall organizing efforts. This is as opposed to people at the top making decisions. We have people at the bottom we have people in the field, in the office, whatever, deciding how things are going to operate. And when people have a say in how they're going to do stuff, then they feel empowered, they feel like they can make decisions too, and they get excited about what they're doing. AstroTurf organizing is a little bit more of a jargony term. We don't use it as much, but it absolutely exists. It occurs when hierarchical organizations attempt to look like they're being grassroots. Sorry, I missed the end of that sentence. When and that should say when hierarchical organizations attempt to look grassroots. This is most typical when corporations or employers are trying to keep workers from forming unions, right? So if you have a union group in a workplace, then the boss will try to get its own group to say bad things about the union. That's a type of AstroTurf as well. And this is done for a variety of reasons. It can be done by corporations for public relations purposes. It can be used to try to get tax write-offs. So it doesn't necessarily have to be political. It can just kind of be like a sleazy economic move. Or it can be due to an inability to pull off being grassroots. So there's an organization, I think it still exists, called Project Learning Tree that went into schools and taught kids supposedly about how the environment works and environmental stewardship and all that sort of thing. Well, the reality is that Project Learning Tree is heavily subsidized by the timber industry, right? So that timber industry, once they're done in their textbooks and their lessons talking about how great the environment is, they also talk about, and we need to protect these resources, right? Not we need to protect the forest or we need to protect the wildlife, but we need to protect the wood that we're going to be pulling out of the forest, right? And use it carefully. That might not necessarily mean what an environmentalist organization would be, but that would be in the interests of the lumber industry to make kids be more sympathetic for them and to, quote, understand that trees need to be cut down. That's what that's all about. It's fake is what it is. Now, another interesting element of community organizing that isn't necessarily in all types of organizing. Community organizing efforts often play off religious organizations, namely because religious organizations are present in most communities, right, in one way or another. And if that organization is present and that organization wants to work with a community organizing campaign or with a union or whatever, then that can be a very powerful partnership, right? Also because it can play off the religious ideology and get people really to do things that that would be beneficial for the organization and then also influential for the people. Many of those community organizing tactics, both relating to religious organizations and other community organizations, were traced back to a man named Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky founded an organization called the Industrial Areas Foundation in 1940. They were not a union group per se, but they were a community organizing group. They were a group that wanted to make communities better. And Alinsky observed that the way you make communities better is to get organizations in those communities to work with each other. So Rules for Radicals is very much a book that anyone who is interested in community organizing should really take a look at. And it's actually quite good for anyone who would be interested in getting involved in social movements or small-scale politics or anything like that. And it's a really readable book. You don't have to read the whole thing at once. That's, I guess, my book suggestion for the day. An example of community organizing, there's a group in Columbus that calls themselves BREAD, which stands for Building Responsibility, Equality, and Dignity. I'm not a big fan of acronyms that are made to spell things like reverse acronyms, but whatever, that's their name. They call themselves BREAD, it's fine. They are an interfaith advocacy organization. So they primarily organize churches, uh, synagogues, mosques, other religious groups, but they also might pull in like a union or two, or might pull in the local political parties. And in doing that, they have these large annual rallies in which local officials are encouraged to either agree with proposals of the organization or disagree. And it's a really very powerful tactic because you get these local politicians who are susceptible to, public opinion and looking bad and all that. And we pull a city council person or a representative of local or state government in front of a group of like 5,000 people, and we ask them, okay, are you going to help us improve our local parks? Or are you going to help us deal with these gang problems? Or are you going to help us deal with this issue of police brutality we're having in this city? They're very direct, very straightforward questions to these politicians. And yeah, obviously a politician will, get shifty a little bit and say, well, I don't know, but that's a bad look in front of 5,000 people, right? So it's a really good way to kind of like influence local politics. It's a really brilliant tactic, and I've seen it a couple times, and it's helpful. With that said, and I'm not super familiar, and I really should look into this. This tactic has become less feasible after COVID, namely because people are less willing to sit in a room full of 5,000 people in early spring to get colds from everyone else. So they have had to shift slightly in that regard, but still, bread does continue in terms of kind of pushing politicians using that public sway and creating kind of a venue for community organizations. An applied fix, so this isn't exactly the same as what bread does, is there are certain areas in the United States and some other places that have created time-based currencies or local currencies. This is a really interesting idea to me. I find this interesting. It is a community organizing tactic that encourages members of the community to exchange services or goods with each other. So remember, when you pay for things with money, you are effectively paying for a cheeseburger with half an hour of your labor, right? That's kind of what we're doing when we use money, right? Well, in a time-based currency, that is more literal, right? So for example, each hour a resident gives helping people, because the time-based currency is based on volunteering as opposed to paid labor, because this is a more informal thing. For each hour a resident gives helping, they are able to receive back an hour of help from another person, right? Just like when I do economic labor for the college, I get money, and then I exchange that for the economic labor of a cheeseburger. One person could build dollars by offering a service, say painting a fence, in exchange for their neighbor helping them with their computer or helping them change a spare tire, right? That sort of thing. And we do this in our society all the time, right? I let my neighbor borrow a bunch of stuff from my garage, and then he sometimes watches my kids for a bit, right? We do it informally. It's a relationship, right? It's not transactional, but there is a certain level of I do this for you, you do this for me. This is the situation we have laid out with each other, right? This is just taking that and making it a little bit more formal. And when you do that, then you can have people do you favors that you don't necessarily know, right? Off the premise that you, someone who earned that favor dollar, did a favor for someone else, right? So this is how another way you can try to build community in a pretty interesting way. So now let's talk some about raising awareness on these issues. So people have to have a knowledge of poverty if they're going to change it. This is a principle among unions, among social movements, known as educate, agitate, organize. So first you have to educate the person in terms of why should they care about this thing, right? If you don't know about poverty, we have to tell you about poverty. We have to show you about some of the uglier aspects of it. And that's what we're doing right here, right? Social movements have made progress in this regard in the past decade in terms of raising public awareness of issues that maybe we haven't talked about in previous versions of our society. I believe it was 2011 into 2012, there was a very short-lived social movement called Occupy Wall Street. And it was also loosely tied to a previous social movement that existed the previous year in the Middle Eastern world called the Arab Spring. Both of those movements used Twitter as it existed then, which was a very new technology then that allowed social movement activists to communicate messages directly to their people to basically create what we now call flash mobs. And to be able to create these mass rallies that authorities couldn't stop ahead of time. And in doing that, they were able to advocate for this idea, especially among Occupy Wall Street. The slogan was, "We are the 99%," meaning that 1% of our society, the hyper rich, control most of the stuff in society. And that sounds like really a no shit to us today. But I will tell you, prior to 2011, to suggest that the hyper wealthy control everything, that was something that people would argue with you about frequently, right? It wasn't something that people acknowledged. This is very much something that Occupy Wall Street put into what's called our zeitgeist, our collective imagination. Very interesting moment. Similarly, Black Lives Matter really, as an organization, brought to light to, especially among people outside of the African American community, issues of police brutality and violence against Black and other minority communities, right? Yeah, sure. White middle-class people knew about this. We've known about this for a while, but by bringing this to attention, it makes us see it more, right? And we have this idea, Black Lives Matter, that conveys information, doesn't it? That conveys the information that there are portions in our society that seem to act like Black lives don't matter, right? And that awareness raising is something social movements do. Another group called the Fight for 15 went from being a really fringe group in the early 2010s. People were saying, no one's ever going to pay fast food workers $15, to becoming relatively mainstream, where in the 2016 election cycle and then again in the 2020 election cycle, this conversation about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour really took off, and where a lot of fast food places and service worker places eventually did raise their wage to $15 to get people to work. Now, with that said, of course, inflation has been pretty bad over the last couple of years, and $15 today is not what $15 was in 2012, but it was part of the ever-evolving conversation of society, right? And that's what social movements do. They inject ideas into society, and when you change people's minds, you then change the way society operates. So in this course, we studied poverty in detail, and moving forward, if you want to advocate for the poor, you have to be sure to share accurate information. And this is kind of the disclaimer at the end, where avoid those things that have been called alternative facts or fake news, right? Avoid getting your news from politically oriented sources, right? Yeah, sure, you might love a radio, you might love a news source because it agrees with all your politics. And that, okay, fine, whatever. If that's how you want to take things in. But before you take a super strong stance that could impact other people, or before you just start saying something over and over again, take a look at a news source that's neutral, right? Things like the AP Newswire, things like BBC World News. I love BBC World News because, yeah, they have their own biases, but they're outside of the United States, and as such, their biases don't really impact the way they report on news in the United States. So it makes for a more neutral source. So let's talk about how change actually occurs in society. To wrap this up, as a general rule, social change happens quite slowly, except for when it doesn't, is basically the key there, right? So most social change is very slow. We saw this in the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement, people sometimes think like took off in like the 90s, or sometimes people even say things like the gay rights movement started in 2013 because that's when the marriage equality Supreme Court decision was made. No, no. The gay rights movement in the United States started in the late 1800s. It was underground into the mid 20th century, and it only became above ground in the 1980s, even though it had a long history prior to then, and then it built very slowly to become the force that it is today. Similarly, the labor movement in its ascent started in the late 1700s, and it worked for 150 years to get to be the powerful force that it was in the 1950s and 60s. And then it declined slowly over decades, really with its lowest point being in the late 1990s. But then since then, it has been growing, and it might now, in the 2020s, be starting to take off in a way that similarly it did in the previous century, in the 1920s. But social movements also can change very quickly. So the trans rights movement, actually. So while the gay rights movement was very slow, the trans rights movement, it was about 2012 to about 2015, it popped off very, very fast, largely because of strategic celebrities that kind of came out as being trans, and the speed with which the internet can do some things. But compared to the gay rights movement, the trans rights movement was lightning fast. Similarly, when you have a phenomena that affects almost everyone in the world, like COVID, changes related to how we see hygiene, how well we wash our hands. Think to yourself, how much dirtier were your hands prior to COVID than they are today? I will admit that the way I washed my hands before 2019 was really bad, really, really bad. And now it's like really meticulous because of kind of the collective trauma we all went through. And then change related to poverty. We discussed all of these, but these are social changes that have occurred in our society related to poverty. So in the mid-1930s, there was dramatic change in the role that the federal government took in solving economic problems. This was the New Deal. These were the other economic measures that were taken to try to combat the Great Depression. In the 1960s, President Johnson legislated the Great Society and the War on Poverty. Those were also rapid changes. Why were these rapid changes? Because they were kind of unilateral decisions that were made by powerful people in society. When people are powerful in society, they can make change very quickly. Between 1980 and 2000, those war on poverty measures eroded more slowly because the people that wanted them were less powerful, and thus it created a slower kind of change. And then also the polarization of income in the United States that kind of started in the 1980s or so and is continuing, and it will probably get worse, where middle class people are becoming increasingly poor and our billionaire class are becoming increasingly disgustingly rich. That also has been a slow process. Maybe we can try to do something such as a growing labor movement in our country to kind of bring that back. There are definitely analysts that would say that the decline of unions in our country is correlated to the decline of middle class incomes. But these are all examples of social change. These are all examples of social movements related to helping poor people, helping working class people, etc. And that is all that I have for today. So thanks for being with us. If you have any questions related to this material or moving toward the end of the semester, please send me an email. Thanks.